In episode 5, we started to take a look at Victor's troubles, his poor health, his lack of time. Unlike Jayce, he does not want to sacrifice personal ambition, but make something of himself before he passes, and this seems to be to enrich the lives of the people of the Undercity. And thus, like Caitlin before, Victor receives his own flashback sequence at the beginning of this episode, showing us who he is as a character. This girl sees what he's doing and leaves, neither trying to call out to one another. This small interaction shows us that Victor is a bit of an outcast among the children, most likely because of his poor health and the cane that he needs to walk. This is shown to us as he fails to keep up with his toy ship that he's made, unable to move fast enough and tripping over his own legs. The scene even shows us how much trouble he has moving down this small slope. And here we are reintroduced to Singed, a character that on first watch I was unsure if we were going to see again. But this is another good example of how Arcane really likes to reuse everything it can, just trimming down all of that fat that it can possibly trim down in these episodes. Singed mentions that Rio, the creature in this scene, has a rare mutation and is dying. It's pretty easy to draw the parallels between Victor and this creature, as Victor appears to have been born different from the other children, and this difference is a detriment to him. More so, we know that the present day Victor is dying as well. Victor wants to help Rio, his decision no doubt made at least in part from loneliness and in part from seeing himself in Rio. The loneliness aspect I feel hits a little here, as on the previous episode, we see Victor working while Jayce is out at parties and events or with Mel. And I can't help but feel that this scene was crafted to make these comparisons, Jayce being one of the normal kids and leaving Victor to play on his own, showing that Victor may feel that nothing has really changed and is still stuck on past issues. Like with the other flashback scene, this brings Victor forwards in our minds in relevance as a character. Before he was merely just Jayce's partner, but now he is his own character with his own struggles and ambitions. I mentioned earlier that unlike Jayce, Victor does not want to sacrifice his personal ambition, and this is shown pretty clearly in the scene with Heimerdinger. He's thinking over things at the spot that Heimerdinger found him at as a child. And naturally, if you're in this position mulling over things, you're going to want to talk about what you've just been thinking about. And the first thing that he talks about to Heimerdinger is how Heimerdinger's legacy is secured, that he will be remembered even when he passes away. Without him saying it directly, we can infer that Victor does indeed care about his personal ambitions and wants to make something of himself before he passes. And it's no fluke that Heimerdinger looks down at the butterfly as it lands here, the average butterfly having a lifespan of about 2 weeks or less, further emphasising that Victor does not have much time left. I feel like this could also be a little bit of setup for the future, in that, like how a caterpillar morphs into a butterfly, we may see a similar change within Victor. Mel, painting here, is clearly annoyed at Jayce, not even turning to look at him as he speaks, even the sound of her voice being a little tense. But Jayce tells her about Victor's condition and how Victor saved his life. And as he says this, he looks towards the crystal on his hand. And I thought this was really interesting as it shows that Jayce now considers Victor saving his life to be just as important as the time he was saved as a child. And this emphasizes just how much he cares and how much this news is affecting him. It's obvious that Mel can't stay mad at Jayce, and finally we get to learn a bit about her. She opens up for the first time, not giving us everything we want, but just enough to keep us interested in her and what her past might be. And the information she does give is similarly themed on being an outcast and loneliness, which I feel like is a really natural way to bring up her past in the writing, and that isn't something that comes out of nowhere, but is something related to the current situation that she feels like she has in common with. I wanted to point out that what Victor sees here is shown later in a sort of flashback with Heimerdinger, from where magic caused a great catastrophe. It creates an ominous feeling, and we'll notice this with all the hexcore magic scenes later in this episode. The ominous feelings it gives off, alluding to just how dangerous what they're doing, how they are essentially playing with fire. And I feel like this could be foreshadowing perhaps for Season 2, where they may choose to go deeper down this magic hole, and there could be serious consequences because of it. Theorem, or Chuck, as Jinx calls him, is clearly on edge around her, and I doubt it's fear, but likely the fact that he's been told not to let Jinx know what's going on. You can see he's clearly nervous here. But what I really want to point out in this scene is how happy Jinx seems to be. In one of her last scenes, Jinx told Silco that she was scared due to what happened in the past. And he relates as he felt the same way, but he managed to come out of it, and he wants her to go through something similar so that she can come out of it like he did. Silco found strength within him when he was almost drowned by Vander, and wants to give Jinx this same opportunity, placing her in the water like what happened to him. I'll speak more about this scene and Silco later, later, but I wanted to highlight again how this seems to affect Jinx. She appears to be completely different from the previous Jinx, though as we find out later this may have just been like a band-aid on her problems. And one thing I really like here about Jinx's character is that we find out from the next scene that she notices that something is wrong here with Chuck, that there's something that Chuck isn't telling her, but she doesn't let that show, compared to Chuck himself who clearly can't keep a secret without showing that he's hiding something. And notice how this scene quietly reminds us of Caitlyn and Vi and what happened to them before moving on to the next scene, which is about them. And it's been quite a while since we last saw them. The start of this episode focusing on Victor. This is a nice little technique Arcane uses to remind the viewers of certain relevant bits of information before going into the scene where they're needed. And we've seen this technique before, time and time again, but just as an example, in episode 4, before we meet Caitlyn, we're introduced to Jayce and her parents first, before finally moving over onto Caitlyn, loading all of the relevant information into our minds before we actually get to the scene where we need it. I really love this scene. The show don't tell here is so good that I feel like I'm almost just going to be given the play-by-play but that's just a testament to how good it is. Jinx knocks out Savika and then begins to interrogate her. She brings up Savika's arm, and we know the two have a sore spot for each other, likely due to the arm Jinx was responsible for destroying, and she goes straight for that point. But Savika knows exactly what to say to get under Jinx's skin, even going as far as to say that Vi has replaced her, and saying Jinx, not in a positive reinforcement that Powder has tried to make it, but in a negative way, like how Milo used to call her in the past. And you can see how smugly Savika looks here, believing she has won. And Jinx realizes this and sneezes, pulling herself back together and pretending like it hasn't gotten to her, so as not to give Savika that satisfaction. And I love what Jinx does to Savika after this. In the past, she would have been humiliated by Milo, but not able to do anything back. And after all these years, she likely has so much pent-up frustration from this that when someone tries to humiliate her, in this case Savika wanting to humiliate her in front of Silco, she lets all of that out and does it back to Savika, humiliating her in front of Silco in a way worse way than she would have done to Jinx. Silco knows Marcus has been wavering, and his act here of showing up at Marcus's house is to show Marcus that he knows what Marcus cares about. But also now that Vi has been seen, he turns to the one person that should know about it. Likely Silco has figured out that Marcus has lied to him, because as we find out later in the scene, Marcus told him that Vi was dead, but hadn't said a word to him about her still being alive in all the times he's seen Silco up to this point. And so this act by Silco is partly to tell Marcus that if he does something like that again, it won't be him that suffers the consequences. Also notice the guys Silco brings with him to this scene. One of them is cross-eyed and reading a book, though it seems like he's just pretending or acting out what he's seen other people do. Dark paint under his eyes, yellow teeth and tattoos on his fingers. Then he accidentally tears a page as he's turning it. And I love the wording Silco uses, using the story of Vander and Vi to ask Ren if she can imagine being separated from her father. The words clearly having a separate meaning when directed at Marcus. I feel like the pet Heimerdinger has is almost like a representation of his emotions. We know what he thinks of magic, and as Victor shows him the Hex Core, a magic that evolves, the pet whimpers and hides back behind Heimerdinger. And I feel like this is what Heimerdinger is feeling in his heart right now. He says that Victor has changed, and though Victor says he doesn't know what Heimerdinger means, there is a weird smile on his face. It's not truly explained, but I feel that's best considering how little we know about magic right here. However, looking back, we can see Victor getting so focused on working on the Hex Core that he forgets everything else, and we think this is because of his bad health and little time that he has left, but perhaps it might be due to something else. And earlier, when he was seeing these like blue chords in his vision, perhaps it's the magic that's doing this, that's corrupting him slowly without him even realizing it. I should also note here that he looks healthier in this scene, so it could be something that happened when he touched the Hex Core directly in the scene before. Caitlyn's gun is important to her. We know this from the flashback with Grayson and how she takes pride in her aim. We can even see in the family portrait in her mansion that she's holding a gun. So it wouldn't be far off to say that this gun is like a part of her. But she doesn't hesitate to trade this gun away for the potion to save Vi when she sees the woman begin to pull the potion away. And despite Huck's deformities, Caitlyn doesn't hesitate to hug him closely, as he's been responsible for saving Vi. Notice the sly smile from Marcus here. Jayce has just been played. Marcus wants to set up this barricade on the bridge to search everyone that passes so he can make sure to get to Vi and Caitlyn before anyone else does and make sure that they don't return. And even giving Jayce the information that Caitlyn had a prisoner released on his order, sowing the seed for the story he will tell when he will bring back news of her death. There is no hesitation in his actions here, whereas before we saw him struggle with what he was doing, here he seems resolute, reminded of what's most important to him and doing everything he can to protect that. This scene is so heartbreaking. I'm not sure Jayce would have spoken up had Heimerdinger not said anything, but here he has to choose between his mentor and his partner. Someone who saved his life and is currently dying, and his mentor, someone he looks up to and admires. We can see in the scene with Marcus before the meeting how distracted Jayce is, and just how he is struggling with what he might have to do. And we can see from the expression on the faces how hard this is for both of them. Humans don't live for centuries. This has been set up right from episode 2, when we first met Heimerdinger, where we find out how old he is and how fearful of magic he is. And then in each scene leading up to this, we see how he rejects any advancements made by Jayce and Victor. I mentioned in an earlier episode that he didn't understand the lifespan of a human and how short it is to his own, but watching the earlier scene with the Hex Core, I feel like this might have just been a byproduct of his fear. It's very possible that Heimerdinger does understand the lifespan of a human. I mean, he's been surrounded by humans since Piltover's birth, but it is his fear in magic that has caused him to be precautious and even give excuses. He does so out of fear of magic, but to Jayce and Victor, it feels like he doesn't understand the lifespan of a human. And this is because Heimerdinger doesn't want to tell them how much he fears magic and doesn't want to relive what he witnessed in the past. Earlier we see how Victor might have been corrupted by the Hex Tech, and I feel the same can be said of the Council, but in a different way. Each of them have had a taste of magic, of the advancements and wealth it can bring them. But each of them likely look up to Heimerdinger the same way Jayce does. They would have all been children looking up to Heimerdinger on the Council at one point, him being a sturdy rock throughout their lives, but now they are being forced to choose between him and magic. And regardless of whether this choice is done out of greed or loyalty, we can see that each and every one of them struggle with this decision. And Jayce most of all, even after declaring the motion, he hesitates to raise his hand for a moment at the end. You can feel so much of this without any of it being said in perhaps one of the best displays of show don't tell in the whole series, making one of the most powerful scenes in Arcane. Vi wakes, still seeing flashes of her past, and where Caitlyn is, she sees her mother. Both have similar hair colour, but more importantly, the fact that she is unconsciously seeing Caitlyn in this position shows us just how much she trusts Caitlyn and how much she views Caitlyn already as a place of safety. And this scene highlights more of the differences between Vi and Caitlyn. To Caitlyn, it's odd that Vi doesn't have parents, and in fact, they were killed by enforcers, the current profession she is. She still doesn't fully grasp how dangerous it is down in the Undercity for the children growing up there. Finally here we see that Silco has caught up with them. We see Huck taking the shimmer, likely having given into the temptation and sold out Vi, which very thematically represents the struggles many of the characters have gone through in this episode, or rather the weaknesses of them not being able to overcome such a struggle. We can see this with Jayce earlier having to go against Heimerdinger without being able to come to a compromise, and Marcus who finally falls into line and does what Silco wants him to do. And now with Huck giving into temptation and taking the shimmer. And we can see all the way back in episode 1 that he was an addict. It's a small touch, but we can see that when Vander pours the beer back in this episode, you can see the longing in his eyes and his finger tap on the counter as if gesturing to the mug. And also the scene where Caitlyn gets the medicine, we can see Huck's eyes lingering on the potion that looks to have shimmer in it. He's already an addict and we can tell it all the way from back here in this first scene. Which, just to add again, is something I love of just how in depth even Huck, who has only a couple of minutes in the entire season of Arcane, has been ridden with so much depth of character. This episode almost feels like it has been themed around the failure of these struggles. But I feel that this is why Caitlyn's actions here are that much more impactful. She, along with Vi, are still struggling and fighting to succeed. And seeing everyone else around them giving up makes us want them to succeed all the more. Jinx here risks being abandoned again if Vi doesn't show up. She puts everything on the line to do what she is doing. And here we see her dead family, Milo symbolising her pain, crying a silent scream, and Clagger looking up in hope. both showing the internal struggle going on inside Jinx at this moment. Pain and fear in the form of Milo, that she will be abandoned again and Vi won't show up though she promised she would, affirming the belief that she is a Jinx and unwanted. And hope in the form of Clagger that Vi will keep her promise and show up. And considering how much of a tragedy Act 1 was, it's almost a little surprising that Vi actually managed to show up here. It would have been so easy to see Vi not being able to turn up at this point, and this rift in Jinx of who she is, Powder or Jinx, finally being settled at this moment, like pushing her to that point of no return. And that would have been such an easy way for the writers to make this happen. But it's really great here how they're like, no, it isn't going to happen like this. We're going to go down the hard path and really fight to have this struggle between Powder and Jinx happen, and which will eventually lead to that conclusion in episode 9. Jinx has kept the flare the entire time because she has kept onto that hope that Vi will come back. And Vi hugs Powder, clearly showing how much she's missed her. And in that moment, Jinx drops the Hex gemstone. This shows us that her sister is more important to her than Silco's mission, and that her sister is more important to her than Silco is. But when Caitlyn arrives, we can tell that what Savika told her has gotten under her skin, and she believes that Vi has replaced her. And we can tell here that she is actually hearing auditory hallucinations, as Milo affirms her negative assumptions, Jinx spatting back at him, and the others asking who she's talking to. And as things start to escalate, Vi sees that what she said to her sister all those years ago has affected her in such a way that has changed her identity. She tells Jinx that she's not going to leave her again, no matter what, and touches her delicately. The two used to cuddle and touch heads in the past, and this is Vi's way of showing that she wants to go back to the way things were before, to how close they were before. But we can also see that when Vi touches her, the distortion happens for when the voices are talking to Jinx. And in that moment, without there even being words being said, we can tell the struggle Jinx is having internally, that she's telling herself that this can't be happening, that it's just a dream, one that she's clung to all these years, and that she's a Jinx, so she would never be lucky enough for something like this to happen to her. And we can tell that this is something that Jinx fought, because when Vi hugs her initially, she asks, "Are you real?" Jinx has gone through so much trauma, especially the one of being called a Jinx by her own sister, and likely coming to believe that she could never be lucky enough for Vi to come back and tell her that she didn't abandon her. And I love what happens when the firelights show up. As we've seen through Act 2, how close Vi and Caitlyn get, needing to rely on each other through traumatic events. This highlights just how close Vi and Jinx still are, regardless of what they say to each other, regardless of how they fight. They're siblings and they trust one another, and as they now have to fight, they are immediately back to back here. And finally, Vi seeing Powder smile as she attacks the firelights. This is likely something that she has been praised for by Silco in the past, and Vi blaming herself for this change in Jinx, this change in her sister, thus ending Act 2 of Arcane. So this is the character map for Episode 6, finale of Act 2 of Arcane. There hasn't been too many changes, and this is how it should be. Like with Episode 3 and Act 1, generally when you're doing a story and you're doing your beginning, middle, and end, there's not going to be too many extra characters past that halfway point, or past that like 2/3 point. And I know this is like technically, Episode 3 of 6, if we're counting Act 2 and Act 3 as like one big story, but it's still a part of the story that is leading up to a climax. And generally we don't get too many new characters or too many new things introduced to past that point. I guess firstly, to start off with Victor, we can see here that we've got more links now coming off of Victor, especially if we consider how many links Victor had in Act 1 compared to now in Act 2. And it's easy to see here who the main characters are of the show. We can see how many links Jayce has coming off of him. We can see how many links Caitlyn has coming off of her. We can see how many links Jinx has coming off of her. And it's kind of interesting in a way that Vi does not have that many links coming off of her. She still has a lot of links coming off of her, but not quite as many as some of the other characters here. But I think we'll see later on, as Act 3 starts happening and Vi's relevance becomes pushed forward to the forefront, that we'll see more links develop from her character. Since Act 1, Victor has gotten a link to his assistant, Miss Young. He's got a link to Singe, and he's got a link to Rio, that kind of pet that he really kind of sees himself in. and really cared for as a child. Mel is still very much by herself, just waiting to have more links added to her, waiting to be pushed closer into the forefront. And Marcus, I've added his daughter in here just to show that, you know, because of how important she is to him, because she is the reason why he is doing what he is doing. And kind of as almost like a byproduct of all this, we see more links going into Silco as his character relevance just becomes greater and greater and greater, especially when you compare this to what his character map looked like in episode 4. The first part of Act 2. But other than that, there's not too much more to be said from here. I guess we can compare what this is like to, you know, compared to the beginning of Act 2 to the end of Act 2. And we can see that, you know, really there has been a lot more links that have happened, especially when you compare this to the diagram in Act 1. There are a lot more links happening all over the place. And like the barrier between Piltover and the Undercity is almost gone when you look at this diagram. Compared to Act 1, when you see that diagram, you can see there was just a stark difference with barely any links from the Undercity to Piltover. But now we can see there are a whole lot of links as all these characters are all interacting with each other in different ways. And that has been the Act 2 finale of Arcane. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this. If you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button so you know when episode 7's come out. And if you made it this far in the video, please don't hesitate to hit that like button. This has been That's Evan Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.